GBV has become a norm, which shouldn't be the case. I have been a victim, but today I choose to speak out for myself and for other women out there. Let us raise our voice against GBV, and we can fight it together.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are listening to us from. Welcome to the Raised Voices podcast. I am your host, Liam Tonga. I am extremely excited about today's discussion. We get to discuss about the lasting effects of colonization on gender roles and how this has shaped gender-based violence. You must be asking yourself, why this topic? Colonization has had an impact on gender-based violence, but I will not get into details. I am not alone today. As we get to discuss this important conversation, I am joined by my co-host, and this just got better and exciting. Two elders from Zambia and Canada who will later explore the impact of colonization and the role of traditional practices in addressing gender-based violence. To guide us through today's discussion, I will hand it over to my co-host who will introduce herself and our guests and lead us through this conversation. Over to you. I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth, and you can easily call me Elizabeth. I will be the co-host during this podcast discussion, and I'll be with Leah discussing colonization and how it has impacted on our culture. So before we can start, I'll invite all of us to introduce ourselves, starting with the team which is here. You can introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Emily Sikazwe, the founder of Nyapachuma Memorial Foundation. I'm a feminist, gender activist, and my tribe is women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so great. I'm so grateful to be here. My name is Farada Jacob Lightning, or in my language, I'd say Tansi Spimisa Timsi Gasun, and I'll pass it to my colleague, Katie May.
Hi, I'm Katie May Anawak Dunford. I am an Inuk woman from Iqaluit, Nunavut, but now I'm living in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1. I work with the Community Wisdom team, and we focus on gender-based violence. And I've been working with Indigenous youth within the city to talk about what brings them safety and how have they experienced gender-based violence within the city of Winnipeg.
Our topic of discussion is looking at gender colonization and gender-based violence. Colonization indeed has changed, or rather altered, the many things about our culture, especially when it comes to how men and women relate, where we are seen to perceive and be treated as women. And before we can go deep into the discussion, I'll invite Dr. Emily to come and just introduce the discussion that we are going to have. Emily, please.
Thank you. Allow me to acknowledge the fact that today we are gathering on the traditional land of our ancestors, the Soli Kingdom of Lusaka Province. I pay respect to the elders, past, present, and the emerging of this kingdom, a kingdom that has been managed by women in succession for a long time. Our topic today is a very interesting one. Interesting because the intersection between colonialism, culture, and GBV. I know that many of you from the territories have a similar culture with us, but mostly the similarities lie in the fact that you were colonized as well, and that your cultures and traditions were disrupted just like us.
Having had that introduction, and we do all acknowledge that indeed colonization has had an impact on culture and equally contributed to the perpetuation of gender-based violence. We just want to highlight a few negative cultural practices that have perpetuated gender-based violence due to colonization. Would you like to come in?
I can talk about how colonization has an impact on Inuit communities and gender-based violence. Before colonization, Inuit communities had a complex understanding of gender roles, where men, women, and gender diverse people contributed to the well-being of the community in various ways, including hunting, parenting, and community leadership. There was typically more men who hunted and more women who stayed at home to do the parenting, to do the sewing, and to make tools and clothing out of what was hunted. But those roles of hunting or staying within the home base were not gender exclusive. Traditionally, you were able to, as a woman, come along to the hunting gatherings. And as a man, you were allowed to stay back and learn sewing and to make tools out of what was hunted. It really more so depended on what was your personal skill set and what was your physical ability. These rules were not so binary, I guess. Before I say this, I may not pronounce it the best, but people who speak my language, Inuktitut, hopefully they understand I'm trying my best. The term is Sipinik. It's the Inuit word for our non-binary gendered. And it talks about how colonization of Inuit intentionally tried to erase the existence of our queer and transgendered or non-gendered or gender fluid people within our communities. From what we learn about Inuit history now, not just about gender history or queer history, but all of Inuit history, is filtered through a colonized lens, and it's impacted by what colonization had brought to Inuit. Not that I think the stories that are told now are totally filtered, but when the people who come forward to speak about our traditional stories or the way we were before, there is a lot of Inuit who have a very heavy impact in their heart, in their body, in their spirit of how colonization has directly impacted them and their families, because it was not too long ago that Inuit felt the big heavy impacts of colonization. I suppose Inuit were contacted much later on than most of Turtle Island. But within that, there's still quite a bit of people who do retain the memories of the way we were, even if there is shame or fear within sharing those stories. There's still a lot of people who remember seeing what it meant to have a traditional community or to have been born on the land.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Indeed, from what you spoke, even in our African context, you found that women played an important role when it came to providing for the family from the economic perspective. Even hunting, they could always provide certain information where the men would know whether they needed to go and do the hunting or they didn't have to go. So women played an important role, but with colonization, the women were taken into a subordinate role where their voice was suppressed and they could not speak out anymore.
I think that this also resulted in marginalization of women. And so, women didn't have an equal access to economic opportunities. They didn't have equal access to education. And I think that when you speak about the impact, even today, and I can speak for Zambia, the situation is still the same. You know, you have a women's movement that has, I think, a lot of impact in terms of lobbying for equity and equality when it comes to both men and women. However, there are more men who have opportunities, economic, more men are in decision-making positions. If you look at our government, you have, I think, 3, 4 female ministers only. When you look at our parliament, you have less women. So just to demonstrate that, it's being perpetuated up to today. And I think we all understand the issue of critical mass. You need a certain number of gender to participate in decision-making. Another impact of colonialism that I think perhaps I could speak to is the whole issue of destruction of indigenous norms, the issue of perhaps language. So we were meant, or during, but I think that, as we move, we have moved with our ancestors. And so I think one of the disastrous or the most negative impact of colonialism was really to get the indigenous people to believe that their own language was inferior, not to associate with it, and to glorify or believe that in fact the colonizer's language was more superior. Remember that when or at the time, issues of coding were not very strong. So now we have lost certain understanding of our language. And I think it's only now that we are trying to, be proud of being Bemba, be proud of being Nyanja and use that local language. But I think the impediment is that our colonial masters imposed English. And you will now see that Zambia's official language is English, as opposed to, our own vernacular or indigenous language. And I think that has torn away from identity and also being able to be proud of our language and where we're coming from.
My people are the Nehio or Cree in English, or the Ayet Gabi and Stony in English. But throughout my culture, I've been learning with my grandfather, who's retained a lot of the original teachings and stories, especially the stories of the role men and women play. When colonization came to our places, they taught us that our women were dirty, or that all kinds of things, like they brought so much impurity, like with Christianity, with the Adam and Eve story, where it was Eve who basically cursed mankind. But in my history, we were taught that the Creator created the woman first. Then he created the moon, the water, and the earth itself. And all of those are women. They all bear life and they have that connection with each other. He created the men last out of the mud from the earth. And he said that the man's job is just to provide and protect for the woman. In our culture, we have decisions that were made by the grandmothers. They had the final say. In ceremony, they had the most powerful sacred objects, but their responsibility was higher than man's, because they had the Creator's gift to bring life to this world. And I just thought it was interesting that I'm taught that from my culture, but when you look in Western society, the man is always first. He's speaking first. He's putting himself out first ahead of the woman. There isn't really a balance there. And I love that some of these stories still survived, where they taught us to balance ourselves. As a man, I try my best to step back and let women speak first. Sometimes I kind of mess that up. I'm learning. And I guess that'd be it for me. Thank you.
Very much. I would like us to bring the discussion closer to the core focus of our discussion now, colonization and gender-based violence. You have verbally said how the inequalities continued being perpetuated between men and women, male and female. But also, I would like one of you, perhaps Dr. Emily, to speak to how colonization equally brought inequalities around economic and participation in leadership and education. Would you like to speak to that?
Women in our cultures and traditions were respected in community. Respected because they were mothers first and foremost, but also that they were life givers. So the disruption that happened then, the respect for women who were very vocal in their communities, who made decisions together with their male counterparts, being pushed down. Women were supposed to be tea and coffee and cookies, while the men went to the drawing room to make decisions on what should happen. This is the disruption we're talking about, that they brought it here and our structures changed. Yet, both women and men, as has been said before, were hunters and gatherers, were protectors of families. They could also go hunting and come back and feed the families. So my conclusion is that I had personal experience in terms of discrimination against girls in schools. And my personal experience was that I was not allowed to take social sciences until we put a big fight with my family. And I took pure sciences and later on became an agronomist. I became an agronomist not because that is what was my first choice. I wanted to be a lawyer. My mentor, who was a lawyer, told me that I couldn't be a lawyer because my character was very strong. So I didn't become a lawyer. My second choice was that of becoming an agronomist, and I became one. And I don't think I've ever regretted being that, except in practice. When I was working, everybody would look at me and say, a woman, an agronomist? This cannot be. So again, I needed to prove myself a lot because it was not expected of a woman.
So we were discussing the effects of colonization on culture, and we have highlighted a number of things around, the position of women in society before colonization, around gender roles, how colonization. We have spoken about education. We also looked at the role that women undertook from the economic perspective, that they played a very key role. Basically, we are looking at how our societies were matrilineal, but because of colonization, we drifted into patriarchy. Would you like to say something?
The first thing that came to mind when I thought about colonization and how it affects our cultures is identity. And thinking about naming ceremonies and how children are named. It is now common practice for a woman to have her father's name or her husband's name in a way that it wasn't in the past. So as I work with different rural women in different parts of Zambia, I noticed that they will have their name, and that before colonization would be their only name. But now their names have to be attached to their husbands or to their fathers. This was done for during the period of colonization, maybe for formality's sake, for registration, and things like this. As they get their NRCs now today, as we get birth certificates and so on. So the more bureaucracy and formal ways of doing things that were brought in by the colonial powers, the more identity had to change. And the woman's identity particularly had to be attached to her husband or her father, which took away many other rights that a woman would have in her own right. So rights to land, what kind of say she would be able to have at big family events, be it funerals or weddings. is now attached to first what will be said by her husband or what will be said first by her father, when before she had her own right to speak into those family events.
Listening to that, I thought about how Inuit also had a similar impact systemically when it comes to last names and having to have your husband's last name specifically. Before colonization, Inuit did not have last names. You just had your given name. And typically, you were named after someone because in Inuit tradition, you typically name your child after someone you or the community looked up to. And with that, naming your baby after someone, you believe that your baby will pick up certain attributes of the person you named them after. But with colonization, uh, the government imposed a project called Project Surname, and it went all across Nunavut, and they had assigned every person a last name. And unfortunately, some people were not able to choose their last name because some people didn't know that that was happening at all. So some people were just given a last name by the government. And with that, it also forced Inuit women to have to, I guess, abide by patriarchal rules. They were suddenly like now they have to be with their husband's last name or with their father's last name, and then when they get married, eventually they have their husband's last name. And with that influence, it pushed out what Inuit traditionally did, um, and the way we were, and reinforced these European and Christian influences where men were the head of the household, and now Inuit women were no longer equal. And then alongside that, there was also the normalization of violence under colonial systems, not just against Inuit, but against Indigenous people. There was a lot of violence that happened with residential schools, forcibly removing Indigenous children away from their families and often far away from their home communities. Um, and then there was also the 60s scoop, which also was forcibly removing Indigenous children and forcing them to live with families that they didn't know of prior. Um, and for Inuit specifically, there was not just Project Surname, but there was also a massive dog slaughter across the territory, and it caused Inuit families to not be able to go out on the land as much anymore. And at that time, the best way to receive financial means as an Inuk was to go out hunting. And you needed your dog team to go out hunting because with that fur that you catch, you trade it in to the Hudson's Bay Company, and then they give you compensation, and you have to buy food at the Hudson's Bay Company. Um, and it didn't just cut off an economic means, but with the food with the food that we hunt and that food that we traded, that food that we had usually kept to ourselves back in that day, trading times. So cutting off slaughtering all these dogs, cutting off the transport, the means to hunting, it didn't just have an economic impact, it also had a direct impact of food security, which made it harder on all Inuit families. But as an Inuk mother, I think we all know that when families struggle with money and with food, it's usually a big burden on the mother. And the collective events of all of those things happening very close in time to one another normalized violence on a systemic level and had many different impacts on Inuit lives. And it's just not the way that Inuit were before.
It's a very similar
Yes.
story here in Alberta with the Cree people and the Stoney people. Before, we would take the names of our mothers through our mother's clan name. But due to the effects of colonization, we would take our father's name. Because the colonizers, when they came here, they only wanted to deal with men. They were surprised when they went to leadership negotiations and there was women there. They didn't want to deal with the women and the grandmothers, but those were our decision makers in our tribes and our nations back then. So that changed us from always putting the man forward. But what's interesting is that, well, not interesting, but a bad thing that happened with colonization, as Katie May has mentioned, is the residential schools. There's so much abuse happening there with all these young children. And when they went home, they had all this like anger and whatnot, and they ended up drinking alcohol and hurting each other because the intergenerational violence just continued on from what they experienced in residential school to their families. But back then, that didn't really happen. As a man, one of the most shameful things you can do is hurt a woman. Like it just really didn't happen because the women were like highly, highly respected, and fighting was usually just between other men and other tribes. And I guess that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verida. And from the submissions from your society and our society in Zambia, we are all in agreement that indeed colonization had an effect on our culture, and we have highlighted quite a number. And now I want us to quickly explore looking at before colonization. Of course, many cultures had their own ways of dealing with gender-based violence, which we have identified through the effects that we've just been highlighting. But then the question is, how can we return to cultural practices by identifying positive cultural practices for scaling up in order to offer solutions to gender-based violence? How can we return to cultural practices and be part of, so that they are part of the solution we are facing today? We know that culture, not all culture is negative, some of it is positive. So now we would like to just discuss how we can identify the positive cultures in order to scale up in the quest to sort for solutions against gender-based violence.
Before colonization, Inuit had their own justice systems that focused on accountability, balance, and community healing rather than punishment. And I think colonization, a big strong impact of residential schools in Indigenous community was using punishment and violence as a form of accountability, which is not right. And that I think that is what had a big influence of normalizing violence within our communities. But traditionally, um, elders and women had very key roles in conflict resolution, and it did not include harming one another. Um, it took it took responsibility, um, and there was a lot of land-based practices um, to engage in healing, to engage in traditional skills like using storytelling or learning new hands-on skills helped a lot with Inuit. I think redirecting your focus onto something that you can work on in a positive way rather than punishing someone is what Inuit really wanted to focus on when it came to holding each other accountable. And I think reclaiming Inuit leader, what like leadership, Inuit leadership roles need to be promoted more alongside with elder roles. I think elders need to be taken into leadership roles and decision making roles and um, not just as an opener for a prayer an elder needs to be within roles that can help advise the decisions that are being made within communities. Engaging with young Inuit in traditional Inuit skills and storytellings about gender and about relationships can help challenge what colonization has forced us all to accept within these past two generations. It does show with the way that Inuit are trying to revitalize our cultures and our practices that our traditional ways of justice and healing worked for our people and can work now if we adapt them into a sort of modernized way while still keeping in touch with the way we were. I don't think we need to rely on the colonial systems that have been failing us. Uh, I think it shows that like having Inuit-led solutions for at least Inuit communities, um, it shows that like having Inuit involved within these positions, especially Inuit women, it does help with the issues that we've been bringing forward, especially around GBV and community healing. Yeah, thank you.
All right. From our end,
Yes, so I think that perhaps let me, and I think the question is impact of colonialism, but we also have pre-colonialism, and I think now we're looking at how do we bring some of the practices, some of the customs, some of the culture from our pre-colonial times into post-colonial in dealing with issues of GBV, you know, to be specific. And really, I just want to, first of all, start by looking or stating that during colonialism, the colonial masters promoted male dominance, male structures, and women therefore took a back seat or were inferior or were seen as tools, you know, and men then, if you like, kind of like, because the woman is a weaker sex, because the woman is inferior, I think that promoted sexual violence against women. Women were seen as more primitive than men. And so if you now go back to pre-colonial, you find that we had a situation where there was equal distribution of power. I think that Dr. Emily spoke about you know, the fact that you also had females who were chiefs or who were took the lead with communities as queens, as chieftains. You also had in pre-colonial issues of equal participation. Women were invited, came to the table, you know, as equal partners with men. You know, spoke to what are the issues affecting the community, came up with solutions. And I think that that became a protection for instances of GBV, because then communities were able to shame persons that were perpetrators of GBV. You also had, I think, very strong cultural values, issues of shared responsibility, issues of you know, communal training or empowerment. And so I believe that if you take the pre-colonial status quo and you bring it into the current, I think that these are principles or these practices that can help rebuild the current situation that we have, perhaps make us a more cohesive community, perhaps begin to empower women so that they equally access the same opportunities, you know, education that is adapted to the local needs. And I think alongside, obviously, laws that should be enacted to promote, to protect, women against GBV, I think that we can then slowly have a scenario where we have more awareness on GBV, and therefore have, hopefully, it then means that we have less cases of GBV.
I struggled a bit with the question, how can we return to cultural practices to look for a solution? Because I'm thinking about how there is no pristine, untouched culture somewhere out there to return to. And I say this because I want to highlight how even during colonization, and even before, Africans have always had agency. The colonized have always had agency, negotiation, and have been strategizing and sieving what they will pick and what they will let go of. So a few of my colleagues and I always laugh about how if missionaries came back, if colonial masters came back, they would be surprised how far less converted and how far less quote unquote civilized Africans or Zambians are, because of a level of resistance. There's something about African philosophy and cosmology that has still persisted about how we see the world and how we want to organize our world. And so I'll give an example of marriage counseling, traditional marriage counseling still persisting. That is a very old cultural practice that persisted despite civilization or Christianization or conversion. It just has continued. Africans still find value in being trained traditionally or being counseled traditionally before they get married. And that has evolved in different ways, even to respond to gender-based violence, as the different women who are called upon by the family to prepare a couple to get married are now thinking of, okay, how do we respond to HIV and AIDS? How do we respond to gender-based violence? How do we respond to alcohol abuse and drug abuse? So there's the lessons or the curriculum, the pedagogy has been evolving over time, but the practice is ancient and true to African culture. So there's some resistance that has always been going on. And so as we look at solutions from our cultural practices, I think a good place to start is to ask ourselves what has persisted, what have we resisted, because that's where we'll find what is helping, what is still helpful to us. I think we would also find in what has persisted, what we have integrated, what has become a hybrid culture. What different aspects of African tradition and whatever we got from the experience of colonization, what is the middle? What are we working with? And that is both. It's still even the mix, whatever the mix is still truly Zambian, because it's Zambians who have also been negotiating and strategizing and sieving and negotiating and using their agency to pick out and to throw out. So I think that's a good place to start with, where which cultural practices we can look to for solutions, is to see what we have resisted and what has persisted and what we are currently integrating, and see if we can tap into that and do more. I also wanted to speak to, so I spoke to marriage counseling as a practice that has persisted. I'm also going to add something about how the words of a paternal aunt or auntie still matter so much. Even, the next generation, new generation, will still worry what their aunt thinks about them, because the words of their aunt carry so much weight about what will happen to them in the future, whether they will be successful, whether they are blessed or not blessed. That's a lot of power given to a woman in a family. Why is that power still given, despite all the education and the um, modernization or westernization? This giving power to a paternal aunt is still something that is very important and something that can be tapped into as we look at cultural practices that can offer a solution if we use that well. I also think about how Africans are still very, very, very and deeply spiritual. Everything is spiritual. The demarcations between what is spiritual and what is not spiritual, what is sacred and what is not sacred, is very different in Zambia than it is, I think, in Canada. We seem not to have that separation. Politics is spiritual. Education is a spiritual issue. Everything is mixed in with religion, indigenous religions, um, a keen awareness of the spirit and wanting either to walk in line with who you are spiritually in whatever task that you have. So those are some areas that we can tap into as we look at cultural practices that can offer.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciated what Kai said about everything is spiritual. Because over here in Canada, a dynamic that is in play is when the youth and when they're connected to the culture, the ceremonies, they grow up in a good way and they have good positive thoughts. Because when we teach them and bring them up in the culture, they don't look down on the women beside them. They see them as equals. They see them that they have their place and that they're sacred. And I believe I believe culture is like the key to healing our communities because it's all about balancing and healing who we are and giving up things that aren't so positive, like alcohol and drugs. Before you go into the matotsan or the sweat ceremony, you have to give up alcohol and drugs for 4 days and 4 nights, even longer. My Muslim or my grandfather would always tell me that you can't plan for ceremony, that if you want to live a good life, you have to be sober. And it's just like these amazing, beautiful teachings that helps us become stronger and know who we are. Because we get our spirit names in the ceremony, and that's how you know you're connected. My spirit name is Bimi Satim, which is sky horse in English. But I'm just really happy that some of the youth are really curious, that they're asking questions, their grandparents and grandmothers asking, who are we? Where do I come from? Who are my people? Like that to me is a beautiful thing compared to when residential school or even child welfare today, where they take the children and they place them in different families and they don't know who they are. And sometimes they don't have that support. It's not that they did anything wrong. It's just that the support's no longer there because the government separated it. So sometimes they grow up getting into drugs and alcohol or beating up people. And I guess that's my part. Thank you.
The topic is becoming more and more interesting, and yet time is ticking. But it would be good to just bring. There's one aspect that we had really missed out when we needed to look at the legal system. It's very important for us to look at it, and what is it that we can retain? I know, yes. So Florence, please help us looking at your expertise.
I'm not too sure because it was under another question that you had asked.
Yes.
But I think I just wanted to perhaps not so much a cultural practice and how we bring that back into today's sphere. But really, I just wanted to very quickly just demonstrate how, for instance, issues of property rights have evolved in Zambia. So I think that pre-colonial, and this was in the introduction, I believe, we all understand that 80% of the Zambian tribes or societies were matrilineal. And so, the woman had control over property, over land, etc. Then you move into colonial, and you find that the state at the time ensured that they brought in laws and policies that promoted male dominance, obviously making women's rights to property inferior to those of men. However, when we come into post-colonial, you find that when you look at the legal landscape, you find that immediately post-colonial, we carried over the laws and the policies mostly unchanged for quite a while. And so you still found that women were not considered contributors to property, particularly property that was gained during marriage. So if that marriage ends up in divorce, the woman would go away with nothing. If the husband died, the relatives of the husband would get that property, and the law did not protect the rights of the woman as a wife, as a sister, as an aunt. Now, in trying to deal with that issue, we do have progressive cases that then began to recognize the fact that in the event of persons divorcing, or in the event of the husband passing on, that in fact the courts began to have the women have equal access, if you like, to this property. There was actually a division of this property 50-50 to the wife, or now the divorced spouses. And I think that this was seen as being progressive. However, come 2024-25, there is now a case, Nkata versus Nkata, that now says that you do not split the property 50-50. The woman has to prove that she actually contributed to this property. So if she doesn't keep receipts, if she doesn't in any way keep tab of going to this site where the house is being constructed, then the courts will rule that in fact she can't have 50-50. Maybe the man will negotiate and give her 20% of that. So we see that, and there's been a lot of talk in the legal profession. We see that as being going backwards, particularly, the female lawyers. That is actually going backwards, because in most instances, you may also find that due to gender roles, due to what's happening in the home, a wife is more likely to give the money to the husband to pay for the blocks, to pay for the people that are working on this, on this construction of the property. And so if it ends up in divorce, the man has the receipts when the woman actually contributed. So I think there's also need for moving forward a lot of awareness, so that we're not moving backwards when we have come so far in ensuring that we went back, if you like, Kai, that we went back to the colonial time in a sense, where you had women, also having their property rights protected. So I just wanted to make that point, that seemingly even as culture evolves, you do then have a scenario of progressing, and then now we're going backwards in terms of the issue, particularly of property rights.
Thank you very much for that contribution. It was really important that you had to speak to that issue. Unless there's anything that needs to be contributed from your end, anyone to contribute? Because after this, I'll be giving Emily to just wrap up the discussion. Is there anyone who would like to contribute? We have looked at the effects of colonization on our culture. We also did appreciate some of the positive cultures that could be used to try and address gender-based violence. And also, as Emily concludes, she would equally speak to how we can be able to make these old practices that are positive without getting stuck there. Is there anyone who would like to contribute? Katie, Farida, Kai. Okay, so I'll allow Dr. Emily to just come in and wrap up our discussion. This was quite a very fruitful discussion and bringing out a number of issues that we need to begin to address. Dr. Emily, you can come in. Dr. Skazo.
Thank you very much. Just a quick one to say that cultures and traditions are dynamic. They change with the changing times. What would be good for us is to take or adopt some of our positive cultures and traditions and apply them to the current situation. For example, as Zambians or Africans, we have always known that we're each other's keepers. At some point, because of the disruption of our cultures and traditions, this was seen as communism. But of late, we see it coming back. Every African is talking about Ubuntu, being each other's keepers. And the question is why? It's because we have seen that individualism is causing us a problem. And we're looking back and saying, what worked at that time? How can I be very happy when a neighbor's child cannot go to school because they are poor? If I can, I should be able to say, okay, this term, I'm going to help you with school fees. And another neighbor could do the same. So this child will continue going to school because we're each other's keepers. In addition, Africa or Zambia had communal justice, which meant that disputes, including those in terms of gender-based violence, were always resolved by communal mechanisms. This could involve elders, family heads, or traditional leaders. If the issue is very big, then traditional leaders will come in. Mediation in these disputes was key, and the emphasis was on social harmony and restoration. In some cases, this worked as a deterrent to gender-based violence. Because who would love to be named and shamed by the whole community that you're a violent man to your family? If all this failed, then the elders would discuss and agree on what should be done with this individual. This helped deter gender-based violence. We know that there have been power imbalances and the voices of women have diminished in modern days. But equally, there are efforts. I say this because I've worked with traditional leaders in Zambia, where we are looking at community first stop safe places where women who are facing gender-based violence can go to. And traditional leaders are taking up this role very seriously. And so I think that we can learn from some of these traditions and cultures that are positive, bring them or apply them to the current situation and see how best we can work around gender-based violence. As I said earlier, women as part of our cultures and traditions were respected because they are life givers, they are also mothers. And our society used to recognize this. women had a very big voice in community. I heard from Ferada, I think, who said in his community, this is what used to happen. Women were part of negotiation teams, even when tribes were fighting each other. What happened then that women are no longer having that strong voice? So in modern days, we're looking at the resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security, where African women are saying we want to be present. Anytime there are peace negotiations in any country where there are problems like South Sudan and so on and so forth, we want to be there. We want to be at the table because this is where we are coming from. Women are peacekeepers and peacemakers. So I think restoring some of the good things that used to be there before disruptions is a good thing to do. And for me, I'm particularly pleased because we're having this discussion with young persons from the First Nations and also young persons from Zambia, because the future is yours, in your hands. You can pick and choose what mechanisms can work best for you, borrowing from what our ancestors were doing. So I'm very happy that this podcast is happening because we can learn a lot from each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emily Sikazwe, and thank you so much to the panelists from Canada as well as Zambia. We have had a topic. Our topic has been colonization and gender-based violence. How has colonization impacted on our culture, and how can we use positive, cultures to address, gender-based violence? And it has been well summarized. Thank you very much to everyone.